Hi, I'm Ms. Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, episode New Testament Backgrounds, episode 7, A Few Good Men, the Maccabean Revolt, part 3. And I hope you're going to watch the other ones because this is not going to make a lot of sense without the other ones. The Maccabean Revolt is a lot more complicated than a lot of people make it out to be, and even though I am streamlining it, it's important to know all these little things to realize how exceptional a situation and how deadly a situation this was. How, if this had not happened, the Maccabean Revolt, our world would look a lot different today. I mean, not the least, Yeshua, our Messiah, wouldn't have been born. No Jesus. No, because the Jews were going to be wiped out. Or all the Jews that were remaining were going to be, for the most part, heathens. So, anyway, Few Good Men, Maccabean Revolt, part 3. Okay, so quick summary. Now, the Hellenized Jews were manipulating Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he was being manipulated willingly. He didn't really care what was going on in the Holy Land. Only the Hellenized Jews did. They wanted, they wanted certain things, and Antiochus needed money to take over Egypt. It had been the long-held dream of every Seleucid king to take over the Ptolemaic kingdom. And who was right in the middle? Who was in the little pathway, between the Seleucids and Egypt? Israel. Judea. The Holy Land. Right there is like this little roadway of death. The army's going this way, army's going that way, but army's mostly always moving. So the priesthood was purchased. The troublemaking Jews, the Hellenized Jews that didn't want to be Jews, they said, well, we'll give you money if you appoint one of our guys. If you appoint somebody else as high priest. And so Jason was made high priest. He was the younger brother of the current high priest, Onias III. But you know what? He really wasn't as rabid as those people wanted. So then they said, oh, maybe he'll take more money, because they had all that tax money, remember, from Joseph and Tobias and his, Syrian tax industry. And they said, well, we'll offer you some more money if you appoint this guy as the high priest. Antiochus said, show me the money! And they did, and, Menelaus, you're in. Now remember, Menelaus was not from the line of Zadok, so he was not a legitimate high priest candidate. This infuriated the people. Jerusalem got a new Greek constitution. Jerusalem was renamed Antioch after Antiochus Epiphanes. Not cool. And because of the high priestly civil wars that happened when Jason and Menelaus' people were actually warring, when they thought Antiochus was dead, when Antiochus turned out not to be dead and his man Menelaus had been ousted, well, he took that personally, because how you treat a king's officer is how you're treating the king. And he said, I've had enough of these people, now I do care what's going on. I thought that they would come in line as soon as they had, gymnasiums and my guy in office who was pushing Hellenization. And, once they had the gymnasium and the theaters and the hippodromes, because remember, the hippodromes are where they hold hippo races. There's nothing more thrilling than a hippo race. Now, we told you, remember, 2 teachings again. Hippo is horse, hippodrome, horse racing. So things were not going well. And the Jews, the rank-and-file Jews, did not want to be Greek. They didn't want to dress like Greek. They didn't want to talk like Greeks. They didn't want to be Greeks. And he'd had enough. And so on Kislev 25, which is in the winter, falls on a different day of the Julian calendar every year, he put up a statue of Zeus in God's holy sanctuary. And he sacrificed a pig on the altar of God. Absolutely defiling the altar and disrespecting God in his own house. It doesn't get much worse than that, except it's going to get much worse for Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, so this was only the beginning. I mean, he wanted more than just Jerusalem. And so the Syrian soldiers were sent out to enforce Antiochus' decrees in the countryside. Jews were being forced to sacrifice to pagan gods and to eat sacrificed flesh, both of which were forbidden, because when the Greeks sacrificed, they sacrificed pig. Now God's word is clear. Pig is not food. And so not only was he commanding them to eat something that was not food, but he was commanding them to eat food that was sacrificed to idols, which is a big no-no. That's no. No, you don't eat food sacrificed to idols. That's partaking in the flesh of an idol. No, you don't do that. Anyway, women were even being slaughtered for circumcising their infants. I mean, it's a horrible thing. And I realize that kids are watching, but it's important to understand the times. And women would be hung, and they would hang their babies around their necks if they were circumcised. So you've got to understand the love these people had for God. You know, there's even a story in 2 Maccabees 7 about Hannah and her 7 sons. And I'm not going to talk about it here because I will just start crying because Miss Tyler's a crybaby and she gets so emotional. Anyway, it's worth reading. And on last week's blog, and I will post the resources again on this week's blog, I provided you with links to 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the works of Josephus, all the things that I'm pulling information from. The cruelty that was being displayed was horrible. But Jews were running to the hills and willing to die so that they could keep God's laws, so they wouldn't have to dishonor God by valuing their own lives above his honor. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Hasidim. Now, you've probably heard of Hasidic Jews. Totally different thing. Now, the word is the same. Hasidim means pious ones, okay? But this was a different Hasidim movement, okay? People started actively, these were the people of the land. They started actively opposing the decrees of Antiochus Epiphanes, but they wouldn't fight to defend themselves on the Sabbath. Well, what do you think happened when Antiochus Epiphanes' soldiers figured that one out? All you got to do is attack on the Sabbath. And they wouldn't defend themselves, and they were slaughtered. They were just cut down. While you have to admire their willingness to die, not to defile the Sabbath in any way, at the same time, something had to be done. There had to be an answer. Now, Matthias Hasmonea changed everything about that. And the Hasmoneans, now we don't know why they're called the Hasmoneans. We don't know if maybe there was, his father was Hasmon, or our ancestor was called Hasmon. We don't know. For some reason they were called Hasmoneans. We don't know everything. I know almost everything there is to know, but I don't know that. You don't believe that, do you? Me neither. All right. So, first they come up to Matthias and they said, hey, we hear you're a big cheese in this community. Let me tell you, if you will lead the way, we set up an altar here to, our gods. And if you'll make a sacrifice, and if you'll eat of the sacrificial meat and kind of, say, hey, that's really great. I think Hellenization is the way to go. Then, there's a lot of money in it for you and, some position. Your sons after you. Things will be good for you. You'll be a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes. Of course, they probably didn't call him Antiochus Epiphanes because Epiphanes was a nickname. Meant madman. I'm thinking they didn't say that. Just a guess. Could be wrong. Probably not. All right, so they bribed him, and Matthias is like, are you deranged? And about this time, he sees another Jew coming up, little piglet. He's gonna sacrifice on that altar to save his own neck. And so being a Levite, and the Levites are very zealous, which is why they had these positions in the first place. This is why they were given the priesthood, because Levites were zealous, and then Phinehas was very zealous, and then Zadok was very zealous. So they were given charge of the temple and the priesthood because God knew that they would guard it jealously, and that they were even commanded in the Bible, kill any stranger who approaches. So if anyone tries to do anything hinky, kill him. Okay? Everyone knew what not to do. So Matthias sees this Jew about to just disrespect God in front of everyone, and he took a spear and he killed him. Then he killed the Syrian dude too. And then he and his sons, they ran for the hills. And the interesting thing is they didn't go after the Syrians preferentially. So they go out in the hills and they form little bandit bands, okay? And they attack small groups of Syrian soldiers when they find them, yes, but who they mostly went after were the collaborators. The Hellenizing Jews who started this in the first place, because everybody knew Antiochus wouldn't even be a part of this. If it hadn't been for these meddling, wannabe Greek gooberheads. Now, they still had the problem. What happens when the enemy attacks on the Sabbath? Because they figured this out by now. Say, all we gotta wait is, till, Friday night, go in, by brunch on Sunday, we'll just, easy work. Well, Matthias Hasmonea, he was a priest, okay? He made a ruling that says, for the sake of survival, for the sake of the survival of the Jewish people, and for the sake of instituting God's worship back to him again, for removing the defilement from the temple, for the survival of Jews, of God's people in the land of Israel, it is permissible to fight on the Sabbath in self-defense, but they didn't go after people on the Sabbath. Different. And I'm going to tell you something called Pikuah Nefesh, and it is one of my favorite concepts in Judaism. We see it pop up in the New Testament in the phrase, the spirit of the law. Pikuah Nefesh. It means saving lives. So, because you get these questions, how can one love God and their neighbor through a strict observance of the commandments? Sometimes you can't. I want you to think about, is there anybody who doesn't really, 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 really admire people like Corrie ten Boom and Irena Sendler and Oskar Schindler, Gentiles who, well, Oskar Schindler, I don't think he was a Christian, but Irena Sendler was a Catholic, Corrie ten Boom was a Protestant, and they lied and stole and subverted the government in order to hide Jewish men, women, and children during the Holocaust. Did they sin? Well, look at it this way. They lied, yes, but what would be the greater sin? Lying to the Nazis and preventing them from committing murder, or telling the truth and allowing innocents to be slaughtered? You see, there is a higher, in every situation there's a higher law. Which one represents loving your neighbor? Because the two greatest laws are these. You must love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. There's nothing loving about telling the truth and watching innocents be slaughtered just because you don't want to lie. Okay? Pikuah Nefesh. Now, so it's talking about the higher law, the spirit of the law. Now, that doesn't mean we can just ignore God's laws when we want to ignore them. But for the purpose of saving lives, there are some things we're permitted to do. Of course, we can never murder someone who's innocent. That would be horrible. But throughout the Bible, we see situations where people did do things like lie but they did it with the mind of saving lives. Not to hurt other people, but to save lives. What Corrie did and what Irena did. They saved lives, and they didn't hurt anyone. To tell the truth would have hurt many people. It wouldn't have only hurt the innocent people who would have been slaughtered. It would have hurt the people who did the slaughtering too. All right, so, spirit of the law, Pikuah Nefesh. Did you think that was a Christian concept? I did for a long time too, but no, it's a Jewish concept. It's very, very, very old. But the thing that you cannot do is idolatry. You can't commit an act of idolatry to save somebody's life. You can't commit an act of idolatry to save your own life. You can't do it. Okay. And that is what Hannah and her sons died because of, because they were going to force her and her sons to worship other gods. And they weren't willing to do it, not even to save their own lives. Okay, so the Hasmoneans, who were they? There was Matthias. Matthias was the dad. Of course, he was from a priestly family. Then his sons, not in order of birth, in order of importance. Judas, he's the most important, he's the most famous of the Maccabees. Jonathan, Simon, and then John and Eleazar. So, I mean, this is like 5 sons and their dad duking it out with the Syrians, and because Judas was such an amazing warrior, all of a sudden, and they were winning battles, all of a sudden, the other people who were in hiding started flocking to them, and they developed an impressive little army. Now, like I said before, the Maccabean Revolt, much of the focus was on eliminating the Hellenized Jews because they were the traitors, they were the cause. Antiochus Epiphanes was just the tool they used, and his soldiers were just pawns. Now, they had to be taken out when they threatened the Jews, absolutely, but they weren't the prime villains. Okay, so the Maccabeans fought with and they were called the Maccabeans later because Judas, his nickname was Maccabeus. It's like the hammer, if I recall correctly. And so they were called the Maccabeans later on, probably not at the time. All right, now, he fought with the Syrians and allies only when necessary. You know, the amazing thing was there were battles where the only way they could win was through God making some miracle. Because it was kind of like, oh, but God made miracles sometimes, but other times Judas was just really a brilliant military mind. You know, priest. A lot of times in the Bible we see priests that are really amazing warriors. All right. Now, the Syrians, the Seleucids, had a lot of allies. Why? Because all these nations around them had remembered being taxed, and they wanted their revenge. Now, so this went on for 3 years where they were battling against the Seleucid armies and their Gentile allies who all wanted to get their revenge. And it took 3 years. 3 years. But after 3 years, they marched back into Jerusalem. Now, what they saw when they got to Jerusalem was horrible. Horrible. Idols on every street corner. It was overgrown. All the inhabitants had been driven out. There was a Greek fortress that had been built called the Acra to the south of the Temple Mount, and Greek soldiers were there guarding the entrance to the Temple Mount. However, by the time Judas and his soldiers, because by this time their dad had died and Judas had taken over the army, by the time Judas and his soldiers got there, they were holed up in there and they weren't itching for a fight. And they actually remained there for a long time. Now, what are they going to do? How do they fix the terrible mess? Jerusalem is a mess. The temple has been defiled. How are they going to clean it? And what is going, and what is the first Hanukkah going to look like? So, that's it for this week. We'll talk about that in part 4. I hope that made sense. And, very excited about these teachings. I hope it's been clear because there's so much information. Anyway, I love you. I'm praying for you. And I pray you have a wonderful week studying the Scripture together as a family. You take care, and looking forward to having a happy Hanukkah very soon. Bye now.